your life shifted and changed
Oh,
forever.
oh yeah. Oh, he looked at me and he's like, I'm sorry. He's like, there was nothing I could do. And next thing I'm sitting there like, you gotta be kidding me. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. The man that has been in my life for 41 years, the one consistent thing outside of God and my mother, you're telling me he's gone?
How did you handle being torn between Lamont and the ministry? Where did the strength come from? Because
I have no clue.
listen, dude.
I have no clue.
Stood in your father's shoes. Did you have people that was like, nah, not Lamont?
I was like, you can decide whether or not you want to still remain a member of Faith Baptist Tabernacle.
Welcome to another episode of Talking with Pastor C, a place where we can be real and candid, and we use our theme, we're going to live, laugh, and love. Today, I have the opportunity to talk to a young man, and our subject, if you want to put it that way, is stepping into his father's pulpit. And I have a young man here, a guest here, whom I've known for some time now. I've watched him grow in ministry. I watched him get married and become a father, a husband, and so many things. And he is anointed by God. So today we want to hear his side of the story because a lot of times we don't hear the backside of things when things happen and when things take place in our life. So I would like to introduce, and here at Let's Talk with Pastor C, we don't use titles.
Right.
We go by first name. So there's no disrespect to who he is in the kingdom. We understand. We understand. We understand. Al Cornell, he's Lamont. But I have a privilege to introduce someone that is so anointed by God. And I'm just amazed at what God has done in his life and how God is maneuvering him and moving through him. I love to see his ministry when I go to church to visit. I love to see him in action. He's a ball of fire, a ball of fire. And that's none other. I'm going to call him by his name for just this time, Bishop Lamont Brown. Amen. We welcome you, sir. So today we want to hear your side of the testimony. Because a lot of times when we go through a transition like you went through, we don't have time or nobody understands, like I said earlier, behind the scenes, what you dealt with, what you had to deal with, and sometimes what you still deal with. So the first question we're going to start out, we got to ask you, just introduce yourself, tell your story. Can you just walk us through your life as a child and then your life when your father left this world?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it. Like you said, we do go back
Yes.
a long ways,
Long.
long ways. And I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be able to share with you and everyone else that'll be watching and
Right.
listening how God transitioned, Faith Baptist Tabernacle. Um, and it's quite interesting to a certain degree because for me, I never thought I was going to be the pastor.
Wow.
To be honest with you, I really thought at one point that my brother and his wife, which is my sister Shannon, my brother Kyle, I thought that they were going to be the next pastor. Obviously several years ago when they were moved up here and they were moving in ministry, and I was like, oh man, I was like, they got it, But then next thing you know, things didn't work out, and so I'm sitting there like, Lord, I was like, okay, what's going on? What's happening here in ministry? And I was just like, all right, let's just put our nose to the grind and just do what needs to
Right.
be done,
Right.
because one thing that I've always wanted was my pastor to be able to look back and say, that one got it.
That one got it.
That one got it. I can sit up there and say, you know what? They took what I said and they ran with it, So I was always looking to help him out and make sure that, he dropped something, I was there to pick it up. He didn't have to want for anything.
So in essence, you were a server, a
Oh
servant.
yeah.
You served.
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. Because like I said, I didn't want him to sit up there and have to do, put 30 plus years
Right.
in ministry and not be able to look back and to see the fruit of his labor. I was like, no. So like I said, when I was young, I would always be right there by his side.
Right.
right there by his side. You know, back really like back in the day, the sanctuary used to get flooded before we had carpet and other things like that. So my dad and I, and we had a church janitor, Mr. Wingo. When it got flooded, we'd be down there with the wet dry vac, mops, you know, all that stuff. And I'm sitting up there trying to sling a mop around that's heavier than me, you know, and slip sliding across the floor and all that other stuff. You know, so I've always been by his side, you know, working and helping,
Right.
you know, whatever way I can, you know. So that's, you know, kind of where I come from,
Right.
you know, and just like I said, just making sure that he didn't have to want for anything, you know.
It's something because you answered both questions I was getting ready to ask you next. Like, what role did you play in the ministry? And I I I do believe that in this era that we're in,
Mhm,
nobody wants to really serve.
mhm.
They look at serving someone as it's a downgrade.
Yeah, yeah.
But I found for me, when you serve a leader, a good leader, those qualities fall on you.
Mhm,
And it also teaches you to be humble.
mhm.
I mean, you could have on a suit shirt, like you just said, you were down there in Bishop, your father was downstairs slinging water, getting water to
Mhm.
prepare the people to come into the house of God so that
Yep.
they can worship the Lord. But he wanted to make sure things were set in
Yep.
order. And here you are behind your father doing the same thing. So that built some good qualities
Mhm.
in you. So now you know how, when you stand before the people, you still have that mindset of serving the people
Mhm.
and not you,
Yeah,
not you.
yeah.
So the day that your father left this earth, where were you? What were you doing?
And it's funny that you mentioned that, and like I said, you asked because we used to have a school that rented the second floor in the church. So he didn't make it down to the church that morning
Wow.
because it was on Friday, January 13th. And so I was down there um, letting the school in, and we were texting. We were texting because he was concerned. He was like, you know, just to bring you up to speed, that year or the previous year, he had just announced that he was retiring.
Wow.
He was retiring from pastoring, and so that year, I think it was 2017 or something like that. He ended up uh, planning out retirement services. So I believe in that December, the December that we had, yeah, that previous December of the previous year, we had the New John Howard Gospel Caravans.
Right.
That was the first retirement service. And then that Sunday before he passed, we had Bishop Miller for the afternoon service, and that was one of his retirement services. So then that Friday, I'm sitting there at the church and he's texting because he's like, you know, being who he was, he's like, I want to, you know, be able to preach and, you know, this, that, and the other because, you know, he was having some type of, you know, problem with breathing and stuff like
Right.
that throughout the week. And he's like, I know. And I ended up texting him. I was like, listen, I was like, the people have heard you preach enough.
Wow.
They just want you here.
Here.
That's it. You know, and that was one of the last texts that I sent him. And then next thing you know, I get a phone call after I hit send, and it was my mother. And she was like, Lamont, you need to get here to the house. And so I had to sit up there and wait for the secretary of the school to get to the church. And then I bolted out the door because I was like, okay, if she's calling me and telling me that something is going on, and the next thing you know, I'm sitting up there flying down Bangs Avenue, hit, you know, the next street, skirt, then pull up to the house. And then next thing I know, my mother is there at the door with the door open. So I was like, oh yeah, something is up. So I jumped up 3 stairs, no, 4 stairs. I jumped up 4 stairs, took 1 step into the house, and then ran up the rest of the stairs. And my dad was sitting at the end of the bed, sitting up there, you know, sitting up there. And so next thing I know, I was like, all right, mom. And I was like, let me call 911. And so the next thing I know, I called 911, And I told him, I was like, my name's Lamont Brown. I'm having a medical emergency at 1603 Bradford Avenue. I need you to send the EMTs.
Right.
And so immediately after I called 911, then I called the real 911 because my mother and I ended up grabbing the oil
Right.
and we started praying. And I mean, when I say we went in, we was calling on Jesus
Yes.
like Elijah was calling on him at
Oh.
Mount Carmel. And I mean, we was going in. I mean, grabbed the oil, rubbed his head down, all of this stuff. We was like, Lord, whatever's wrong, this, that, and the other. And we going into tongues. I mean, we just going deep in there. And then, and so next thing you know, the EMTs come in, and they do what they got to do.
Right.
And then next thing you know, they take him out, and then they transport him to, Jersey Shore, and so then I get my mother and we get everything together, and then we go to Jersey Shore. And next thing I know, we sitting there in the emergency room and they have him in one booth. And then next thing you know, my mother and I are sitting right outside of it. And so then, they tell me, they was like, well, we got to take him upstairs for emergency surgery and stuff like that. And I was like, oh man, okay. So then next thing I know, I was like, I don't want to leave my mother there,
Right.
but they're like, we need you to come upstairs and wait in the waiting room. And I'm like, all right, I'm torn between two
Two
places.
places.
And I said, I'm like, Lord, I was like, okay, I can't go up there, but I got to be down here with my mom. But thanks be unto God, my sister, Tisha, she was on her way. So I was comfortable enough to leave my mother there because I knew my sister wasn't too far away.
Right.
And so next thing I know, I go upstairs and I'm sitting there in the waiting room. And so that was like, whoa, Lord God, because my father has never been sick. He's never been sick as far as I know. When, for the years that I was around him, never was in the hospital. And so this time I'm sitting there like, oh my Lord, this is crazy. So either I called or I texted my brother and I was like, I was like, I'm here at the hospital with dad, such and such and such and such. And PJ was like, it's going to be all right. Everything's going to be fine. So I'm like, all right. And then, like I said, my sister got there, and they're downstairs, she's tending to my mom, and the next thing you know, by 12 or so, the doctor comes out. If it wasn't 12, it was like 11:30, but it wasn't a long time. The doctor came out and he looked at me and he's like, I'm sorry. He's like, there was nothing I could do.
Wow.
And next thing I'm sitting there like, you gotta be kidding me. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. And I'm sitting up there like, covered my face and sitting up there crying, because I'm like, yo, you gotta be kidding. I just texted him at 7:45 and he texted me back and I was there at the house. And now by 11:30 or so, you're telling me he's gone?
Wow.
The man that has been in my life for 41 years, the one consistent thing outside of God and my mother, you're telling me he's gone? And I'm sitting there like, oh my goodness. And next thing I know, I turn around and this big person is coming down the hallway, none other than, at that time, it was Pastor Cedric Miller. He was coming down the hallway and he's like, Lamont, he's like, I know you're, want to lose it, this, that, and the other, but he's like, I need you to pull it together. He's like, I need you to kind of hold it together because your mother and your sister are downstairs just losing it. And then besides that, before he got there, I ended up calling PJ back. And I called PJ and PJ, was just like dead silent. I was like, PJ, you gotta let Sheree, all this, and it's just like crazy. And so then next thing I know, I'm going downstairs with Bishop Miller, and mom, and the doctor's trying to explain to us, what had happened. And I'm just like, you gotta be kidding me.
So at that moment in reality, your life shifted and changed
Oh.
forever.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Forever. So at that moment, as the son, did you have to give the news to your mom or did she already know?
The doctor and them did.
Did okay.
Yeah. The doctor and them did because Pastor Willie Barron,
Okay.
he made it to the hospital too. And he was downstairs with my mom and my sister, because as a matter of fact, when the doctor came out, I had it on speakerphone. So then he could explain, what had happened. And so they were downstairs, and I was just like, wow.
And also because I know I've been through this with my sister.
Hmm.
Um, I just spoke to her on the phone. Next thing I know, I get a call back. She's rushed to the hospital. I get to the hospital. They put me in a room. I know when they put you in a room, it's nothing, no good.
Right.
But they couldn't say nothing until either the husband or the parent came. Did you, at that moment when you heard the news, after you got away from everybody else? Because I know I know I did this. For a moment, I got angry with God
Hmm.
because I'm like, God, she was a good wife.
Hmm.
She was excellent in ministry.
Hmm.
She did what she was supposed to. Why would you take her
Hmm.
when there's a whole bunch of people out in this world, in my opinion, don't deserve to be here? So why would you choose a vessel like her? Did you ever question God? Even because I heard you say y'all prayed. Because a lot of times we pray, we look for God to do things, and we always say, Father, it's in your hand, it's in your will. But
Hmm.
when something like this happens, does
Hmm.
those things enter your mind?
Well, the one thing that I have said about it now, years later, is why can't we accept God's no?
Mhm.
It's so easy for us to accept God's yes, but why is it so hard for us to accept God's no? And I just look at it, I know that I'm built different. That's number one. I know my mentality's different because I've had so many people, that have been instrumental in my life.
Right.
So that's why my faith and my thinking and how I look at stuff is totally different. So in the place or answering your question, I never really got angry.
Mhm.
You know, um, I was just at one point, I was just like, wow, because of the books that he was going to write.
Right.
The snowbird that they were going to be. They were going to go down south during the wintertime, and be up here during the summer because they love to be on the boardwalk.
Right.
I was just thinking about the work that he was looking to do because he was about to retire from pastoring.
Right.
And I was like, now he's not going to be able to do that. And I'm just sitting there like, wow. So in my head, in my mind, I never really got angry. I never got angry at that point. I was disappointed,
Right.
but it was never angry with God, because I was just like, well, Lord, I was like, I don't understand it, but it's like the old Baptist song says, we'll understand better by and by. And that's where I came from. I was like, this is going to be a hard one
Wow.
because I was like, this is a nightmare to a certain degree
Right.
that you never
They
expected
never
to happen,
expect, no.
and especially happen the way that it did. Because, I tell people in a minute, is like he announced his retirement,
Yes.
but we didn't know that God had the ultimate
Ultimate.
retirement for him.
Wow.
And so I'm just sitting there like, okay, God, you really retired it, So in that, it was just like, God, okay, this is going to be an interesting one to try to deal with. But the other thing, Cornell, that I will say is in the history of faith, the pastor that was before overseer, it's kind of the same exact thing. So at some points, I ended up looking and I'm like, wow, this is history repeating itself. Because Pastor Wilmore Carter was the pastor before overseer. And same exact thing. He ended up getting sick, going into the hospital, and never came out. And so then that's when, they had a church meeting, all this other stuff, and then overseer became the pastor. And so I'm sitting there looking at it, I'm like, Lord, I was like, wow, history's just repeating itself all over again.
Now, let me ask you, during that period of time before the passing of your father, were you in any type of training in becoming the successor of the ministry, or were you just a minister? Were you an elder? What position did you hold in the ministry besides serving your father?
Well, it's almost to say what position didn't I hold?
Right. That part. Because being a PK kid, you hold so many positions, and folk don't understand. You
Yep.
hold so many positions,
Yep.
and we're not going to get on the standard that they look for you to
Mhm.
stand in when
Mhm.
their own children's not standing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, what had happened was um, the Queen and I went on a vacation. And overseer had he's like, while you're on vacation, I got some homework for you to do. Whoa. And he said to me, I just have one question for you, and you answer it how you want to answer it. If you were the pastor of Faith Baptist Tabernacle, what would you do?
Wow.
That was all he gave me. That's the only question he asked. And so, me being me, but also having part of him and co-pastor in me, I took my computer with me and I
Wow.
just started typing, typing out, I think I had like 30 something bullets, 40 something bullets by the time I got back. And it was only a conversation between the two of us. Nobody else knew about it. And so when I got back from vacation, I gave him a copy of it. And when I say I went through everything, I went through everything from the way services, to way, ministry operates, even to the building and grounds, even to, potential places of where, I see people could be working in ministry. So, I mean, Cornell, I went through every inch. And I mean, I went every ministry, everything. I mean, deacons, deaconess, ministers, all of it. And I just broke it all down. And I gave it to him. And he was like, I wasn't expecting all of this.
Mm.
And so what I tell people is he got a chance to see in written form what others get to see physically.
Right.
And he was like, this is good.
And even listening to that, God was already
Oh,
in
yeah.
the midst of moving.
Mhm.
And I tell people, sometimes I laugh at God and say, your way just, sometimes it's funny
Yeah.
because we're not focusing or paying attention what he's doing.
Yeah.
He already knows our life plan,
Yeah.
our life map,
Yep.
where we're going to be on this date, on that date. And whenever I do a funeral or homegoing service, I say there's 2 dates we have no control.
Mm.
That's birth
Mhm.
and death.
Yeah.
But in between those times, what are you doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you following God's plan? So to hear what was being done, God already knew what was going to transpire, whether it was years down the line.
Exactly.
He already knew.
Exactly.
But did you ever, because I know for me, being the PK kid, I said I will never, ever pastor. I'll stay doing praise and worship. That'll be it. I would never pastor folk. Never. And then all of a sudden, here I am going on 16 years. Did you ever think you would pastor?
Well, like I said, for
Did
me,
you, let me say, did you desire the job?
well, the thing that I would say about it is, I knew that there was an inkling there.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that overseer always told us, he was very transparent.
Yes.
And he told us about how he ran to California to get his California dream and all that other stuff. And he was going to move the family out there, this, that, and the other, because he was running from ministry. And, those that are at faith know the story. And God talked to him so much that even when he was walking up to get on the plane to go to California, God told him, no, don't get on the plane. But he still got on the plane anyway. And so there's all these stories in my head that I know about the dangers of running from God.
The dangers from running from God.
And when it came down to it, I was like, I'm not running. I was like, if it's meant for me to do it, God's going to tell me, I'm going to embrace it, and we're going to run with what God is telling me to do.
Wow.
So as far as running from pastoring, it's like, no, It's like, yeah, do I, would I rather? I was like, I can't see myself doing anything else, you know, besides what I'm doing now.
Wow.
Because I was like, I saw the other side of running. Because my pastor, my dad, overseer told us how it took them like 5, 6, it took them years to get out of the financial debt that he put them in by not giving God a yes.
Whoa.
And so I was like, you know what? If he had that example with that example in front of me, I was like, why would I sit up there and repeat the same thing that he did? Why would I run
Wow, right.
when he gave me the example? He told me what it was. So no. So as far as being, I was like, mm-mm. I was like, no. I was like, I'm not running from it. I was like, I'll run towards it, and God, whatever you have for me to do, that's what you're going to have for me to do. And like I said, I was not looking to be the pastor or anything like that. I was happy being number 2, being the assistant pastor. I was happy with, helping him out, this, that, and other. He would speak. He would say something that he has an idea. I love bringing his ideas to pass,
Right.
all that type of stuff, surprising him with things, working on projects in the church, outside the church, that was me. That was just what I wanted to do. But like I said, when he approached me about that, I was just like, wow. And I was like, I'm just gonna go ahead,
You see,
and do.
you're one of the very rare ones because I rarely hear anyone say they just accept it, but it's because you've already seen the example of if you run, what could happen or what
Yeah.
will happen.
Yeah.
So we're gonna pause here for a moment. I'm gonna look into the camera and I'm gonna ask anyone if you ever been in the shoes where you ran from God, like for you to put in a comment, just comment on it and comment on it. Just, give us a short story of if that were you, if you were in those shoes, what did you do? How did you come out of it? Did you owe
Yeah.
God? Because listen, a lot of times when God speaks to us, when it's something that we really don't want to do,
Mhm.
we will refuse to listen. And
Yeah.
we will try it our way first.
Yeah.
And every time we try something our way, it never ever works out.
Yeah.
But I'm so grateful to God that when he sees us in that state,
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't turn his back on us.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
still remain loving, kind, and
Yeah.
gentle, and his mercy is still with us. So it's good that you had that example.
Mhm.
So then you didn't fall or follow into the same shoes of
Yeah.
running. As for me, this
Yeah.
dude, he ran the opposite way. He ran the opposite way until God shook my life and
Mhm.
said, You got to give me a yes.
Yeah.
It got to the point where it was you either do or you die.
Mm-hmm. And for me, I have heard, and seen and know too many people that have done that.
Yes.
And I'm like, Lord, no, I don't want to do what has already been done. I was like, just let me go ahead.
Mhm.
And if this is meant for me, then it's meant for me. Because I told Overseer at one point, I had told him, I was like, listen, I was like, I don't want the church and I don't want the elders council to assume that if something happens to you,
Right.
that I'm automatically supposed to be the pastor. I was like, no, because I'm like, if that's to be, then it's to be. Because I had always, talked to him about, it's like, you need to let us do, some of the stuff, take some of the burden off of you. So then you're not trying to carry the weight of ministry and all that other stuff. We equate it to being, the Aaron and the Hur sitting up there holding up Moses's arms. That's what and I was trying to encourage him, to do that, but not knowing that, in the background, God was sitting up there working on it. And it's like, yeah, you talking about this, but you talking yourself right into,
Right into
mm,
So after all of that, the passing, the homegoing service and everything, during that period of time, did Lamont, the son, not Lamont, the assistant pastor, but did Lamont, the son, do you think you had your time during that period of time to fully grieve? Because maybe I'm just imagining your mind is on the church,
Mhm,
the people, your
mhm,
mom,
mhm,
your mom.
mhm.
So did you have that time to take aside for Lamont, the son, and just grieve?
Mhm. Well, not all at once.
Okay.
Not all at once. It was over an extended period of time, because one important person was talking to me the whole time, that whole week leading up to, all of that, and that's my bishop, Bishop William Young, and he had told me, he was like, "You're going to get your time, but the people need to see you."
Wow. Where did the strength come from? Because
I have no clue.
listen,
I
dude,
have no
come
clue,
on, come.
because the queen, she had said to me the other day, she was like, she's like, she was like, it's all of a sudden like you just started. She was like, it wasn't like you just gravitated or worked up to it. She was like, we had the funeral, and then she was like, on that Sunday, you were just gone. You were
So you
just,
preached.
yes,
Wow.
yeah,
You preached that.
yeah. We had the funeral that Saturday. I preached that Sunday.
What was it like? What was it? Because I know for me, when my mom passed, she passed on a Friday.
Mhm.
We had service Saturday, and
Mhm.
in my mind, I was saying, because if mom, I've seen her come from dialysis to
Mhm.
church, nothing stopped her from church. So
Right.
I told the people, we're gonna have church.
Mhm.
I don't know where the strength came from that
Yeah.
Saturday
Yeah.
to preach the word. I don't even know where the strength came from to do the eulogy, but
Mhm.
it came from God.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
Cornell was a mess, but when I stood, it's like God just
Oh yeah.
took over, and I can't imagine that quick
Mhm.
to stand in the shoes where your father stood for years,
Yeah. 30 plus years.
and now here Lamont
Mhm.
is standing there
Yeah.
to feed the people. What was that like?
Um, it was quite crazy, you know. Um, but it's one of things where, you kind of go into like church mode.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, this is it. We just going, we just going on in, and that's what happened. It was just going straight into church mode. It's like, no, we're not going to sit up there and diminish, disrespect the legacy, the teaching,
Right.
the impartation, that he has poured into us, that overseer poured into us for all those years, and sit in the corner and have a pity party,
Right.
and sit up there and cry and just lose our mind. Now we're gonna go for broke, because if we sat up there and just went, lost our mind and all that other stuff, next thing I know, I would sit up there and believe the Lord would allow him to come back and be like, didn't I teach you better?
Wow.
Why are you sitting up here snotting and crying all that? Didn't I show you? Wasn't I an example in front of you of how to pray, how to preach, how to teach through all of the situations, the vicissitudes of life? Didn't I show you how to do that? So why all of a sudden now are you going to not use my examples of what I have showed you to do, and not go ahead and do
Right.
what I showed you to do?
Wow. Are you appreciative of the things that overseer embedded in your life now? Because I know there's some things in that my parents said to me where I didn't really grab it. Uh-huh. But now that here we go. Now that I'm in their shoes,
Yeah,
I fully get it.
yeah. I'm I'm one that I review, and I remember, one of my members, Mother Schuler, she always messed with me. She's like, you got a memory like an elephant, because and the queen, she messes with me too, because they'll be like, you will remember the clothes that somebody had on, how they had their hair, and
Wow.
and all of that, and you talking about 15, 20 years later, all this
You
other
still,
stuff. And I tell them, I was like, because I keep those things in my mind, because they're important teaching moments.
Mhm.
And I use all of that, on top of, stuff that I have experienced,
Right.
And so I put all that together to make a nice gumbo, so that, okay, we got the crawfish in there, we got the andouille sausage in there, we got all that stuff. And I just use it all together, because Overseer, what he used a lot of the stuff from when Reverend Pinkston, he was the founding pastor of the church. And he used stuff from Pinkston and Reverend Tate and Reverend Carter, definitely from Reverend Carter. And he put all that together, but he also added in what he was learning and what he knew. And so I just do the same exact thing. I just use a lot of, and some people even say some of his mannerisms, some of their, talk and, stuff like that. And I just continue to use it, but just add my own flair to it.
That was going to be my next question, because when I know for me, when I walked into ministry fully, in my mind, I felt like I couldn't fit my father's shoes. I couldn't fit my mother's shoes until the Lord used my mother one day. I was getting ready to preach. She said, "Son, you're not," she didn't even know this, but that's why, because she was a praying woman. She didn't even know that I was feeling that way.
Yeah,
because I never voiced it.
Yeah.
And before I walked up to preach, she said, "Son, you're not to fill your father's shoes. You're not to fill my shoes. You are to fill your shoes." Did you ever feel like, okay, Overseer's shoes is too big for me to just like step into?
Yeah, because you're talking 35.
Come on, right.
30 plus years of pastoring. And it's funny because he had asked me a question, because my private time and depending on what the question was, my private time with my dad or with Overseer was from about 7 o'clock Monday through Friday till about 7:45. And we would sit there at the church because we was waiting for the school,
Right.
to come. And so we would talk about everything, and so one of the questions that he had asked me, he was like, "So becoming the next pastor, what is, what are you nervous about?" And I said, the biggest thing I'm nervous about is preaching. And he's like, "Huh?" Because I think he would have thought, that I was nervous about, working with the people and the other side of it. But I told him, I was like, "No." I was like, "It's preaching." He's like, "What do you mean?" I was like, "You are you."
Right.
I'm like, "You are you." I'm like, "They are used to you." I'm like, and I'm like, "You got 30 plus years." I was like, and then plus the last 20 years, it was like he kicked it to another level. God kicked it to another level because, God was using his love of teaching. So he used his gift and his love of teaching and used that in ministry. So he was breaking down the word in the Greek and the Hebrew, and I'll be silly, the pig Latin and all that other stuff. And I'm like, yo, how am I going to come behind that? I was like, I'm a young buck, breath smelling like Similac, and you sitting up there, you exegeting, and then besides that, he was going to Full Gospel has a seminary, and so he was going there and learning and listening from Bishop Andy Luter, who is a walking like biblical historian, And that was the thing that was so jolting and to say I was nervous about, but after a while I ended up having to figure out and say, that was him.
That part.
I had to sit up and say, that was him.
So
I was
when did it snap and be like, okay, Lamont, yes, you can have some of daddy's and some of the characteristics.
Yeah.
But when it all comes down to it, you have to be your own.
Yeah. I don't know when it snapped. It might have been, one of the, I don't know. I can't say when it happened, because I have a whole bunch of colloquialisms that I use, when I preach, when it's getting really good, we talk about smack your mama, and all, and people be looking at, did you just say smack your mama? And I'm like, yeah, because, it actually comes from, my dad, because he would come to my job and, he would have either the dirty rice or he had the ribs. and he'd be like, yo, this is so good, it make you want to smack your mama. And so next thing I know, one Sunday, it just came out of nowhere. And everybody looked at me, he's like, did he just say smack your mama? And so, there was a shift. There was a shift. And I can't really say, when the shift happened, because like the Queen, just told me, she's like, it's like you just all of a sudden, it was just like we buried him, buried Overseer. We had the homegoing celebration and all that. And she was like, you just took off.
And you know what? I'm sitting here and it just like dawned on me. And I'm not trying to take the light from you because I don't want everybody to think that, but I understand what you're saying because when my mother passed, the first time I ministered, I stood in that, I had my emotions. And that's one of the questions where did you have I had my emotions where I did break down and cry, but then I got myself together. And if I never preached, and if I never had preached again,
Yeah.
at that time, it just came.
Yeah.
It felt like for me, I had my mother and my father pushing me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how were your emotions the first time you really like preached and it just like,
Well,
you surprised your own self when you sat there, like, did I just do that?
yeah, because there are times when I'll sit there and I'll hear him.
Wow.
I'll hear him come out of me, and the church, they always laugh because they're like, you're a combination of three people.
Whoa.
They're like, there's times when they say we see Overseer, and then there's times when they say we see co-pastor, and then there's times when they say we see Bishop Young, and they'll just be sitting back waiting to see, who's coming out, and there was one point in time, like I said, at the first Sunday preaching, after the funeral, that Sunday after the funeral, where, I did have an emotional moment because I told them, I was like, I know what it's like to be pulled in two different, directions, two different ways. Because at one point I wanted to be downstairs with my mother, and helping her and consoling her. But then on the other sense, I was, needed to be in the waiting room, and so I'm torn between the two.
That's a word, right?
I'm torn between the two. And I said, I'm sitting there and I was like, I see what it's like when Jesus was on the cross. Because he was like, not my will, but thy will be done. And I'm sitting there like torn, being pulled apart, but like I always say, if it had not been for Bishop Young, that walked us, walked with us through all of that, even to this day is still walking with us. Wow. I don't know where faith would be at. Right. Like I said, I know God, number one. But
there's
as a physical,
that person that you
can
confide in and talk to. You just said something, and I'm going to ask. It's not even on here, but that's so. How did you handle? You just spoke and said you knew what it was like to be torn between two. How did you handle being torn between Lamont and the ministry? Part of saying I'm going to help them grieve, and I know you had Bishop Young and your queen and everything. But sometimes even that, how did you balance helping you and helping them? Was it more of them and less of you?
Well, I'll like I said, it was all in a bunch of different points in time. Okay. There was never like one time where it was just like, oh my God, and I'm just, all of that. There was just different, little bit here, little bit there, because I was, at one point I was reading a book written by Bishop T.D. Jakes. And he started talking about, you're building something and you're doing something, and, the person that you want to be there is not there. And I shut the book and I started crying, and I ended up laying on the Queen's lap, and I'm sitting up there bawling.
Wow.
Because I was like, with everything that's going on here in the ministry, I was like, you saw the notes, you saw the blueprint, but now you're not here to physically see it. I think out of everything, that's one of the hardest parts.
Wow.
That's one of the hardest parts because I know how much blood, sweat, tears, prayers, praise, worship, sacrifice, all of that stuff that they put in.
Because you were behind the closed doors when nobody else was there.
Exactly.
So you got to
Exactly.
see it and live. I don't think people understand because I wanted to do a thing with a bunch of PK kids
Mm-hmm.
because we got some stories.
Tell me
We got some
about it.
stories because our parents sacrificed so much financially to we didn't have Christmases
Yep.
because
Yep. Yep.
the church needed this, the church needed that.
Mm-hmm.
So me, can't speak for all my siblings, but I started resenting
Yeah.
because I'm like, why are you doing this for these folk and they
Mhm.
don't care nothing about you?
Yeah.
And now that I understand that I'm in their shoes, it's
Mhm.
not about them. It's
Yeah.
about the ministry. I remember one time the Lord dealt with me because when I first started ministry, I was
Mhm.
harsh.
Mhm. Yeah.
And the Lord had to tell me, He just plainly told me, you have to become a parent
Mm-hmm.
and you have to know how to deal with each
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
You may speak to this one harsh and more harsh than speak to that one, but it's the same thing, but
Yeah.
you got to know how to do it
Yep.
correctly that they will receive it. So my next question to ask you, once you walked and you stood in your father's shoes, did you have people that was like, nah, not Lamont, and if it is him, I'm leaving? And how did you handle that if it happened?
Well, I'll
Because
tell you.
listen, let's be real.
Yeah,
Stuff
mhm.
like this goes.
Oh yeah, it definitely,
Yeah.
it definitely. Well, I'll tell you this, because he had announced a year prior, it gave everybody a
Okay.
chance to start to say, warm up to and other stuff like that. But besides that, some people saw it coming. And just because, and like I said, I wasn't working to work towards, like some do now, they kiss up
We ain't going
to,
there.
but I wasn't doing that. I just wanted to make sure that he didn't have to want for anything when it came to ministry, that he can look back at it. And so I was working, and doing what was necessary. And once the transition happened, and he transitioned to, home to glory, like they would say in the Baptist church. I had told the people, I was like, listen, I was like, I know that a lot of you were hooked to Overseer's Hip. I was like, the way he taught, the way he, flowed and all that other stuff. I was like, I'm giving y'all a year. I was like, y'all have a whole year. And within that time, I was like, you can decide
Wow.
whether you want me to be the pastor or not be the pastor, whether or not you want to still remain a member of Faith Baptist Tabernacle. And I was like, I'm giving you a year. And I was like, after that year is over with, I was like, it's off to the races. I was like, whatever overseer put in place for that year, that's what we were doing. We were not changing anything. We were not adding anything. We were not taking anything away. There was none of that was going to happen. I was like, we're keeping the status quo, the status quo. And so after that had happened, there were a couple people that left, but for the most part, those that left were, already on their way out the door.
Okay.
They just used that
Yeah.
as, excuse to go the rest of the way. But I'm grateful to God that most of the people, they just stayed. They just stayed.
Yeah,
They was like, listen, I ain't got nowhere else to go. This is my church. This is my home church, And so from that, we just, just started moving. We just started working, you know. And like I said, I did have, one mother of the church, she did say, she's like, I had questions about him.
Wow.
I had questions about him. I wasn't sure, this, that, and the other. But for me, I was sure in what God had showed me. I was sure in what Overseer and co-pastor had planted in me. That's what I had leaned on.
Right.
Because I'm like, all the years that they sacrificed and put into me and poured into me, that's what I leaned on. All I needed was, well, not what I needed, but God just had to prove to them that he was still,
This is the one.
there you go.
This is the one.
This is still his ministry. His hand is still on it.
So now that you look at it in our closing, now that you look at it and you see how your life after that day, the steps that were taking to push you where you are today, are you grateful for that? And if you were to say anything to anybody out there, because a lot of us deal with a day where our life is just
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
shift.
Yeah.
It just shift out of
Yeah.
nowhere.
Yeah.
You woke up, didn't expect my day to
Mhm.
end the way that it ended. What would you say to someone out there? We're gonna leave out stepping into your father's pulpit, but because everybody's not stories is not yours. Everybody's
Right.
stepping
Right.
into a pulpit. They may be stepping into
Something else.
something totally different,
Yeah.
but it's still designed by God to happen. What would you say to them to encourage them to hold on and to focus and see what the plan is?
Well, I would tell them that, you hold on to what God has told you. Like they say, hold on to the horns of the altar, and don't let go. Because with this generation, with people now, they are so quick to throw in the towel.
Right.
And they won't see how the end is going to be, because they're like, you know what, I'm just going to give up. And it's like, no, if you have sacrificed all this time
All this time.
and put so much energy, so much effort in, why are you going to sit up there and why don't you go and see the thing the whole way through? You halfway out.
Right.
But because of your mindset, you think you halfway back. And it's like, no, change your mindset. Look at it and say, you know what? Instead of saying, you know what, this cup is half empty. No, look at it. This cup is half full. So I'm going to make sure I do what is necessary.
That's right.
And believe that, you know what, I'm going to come out of this thing. Because I sat up there, sermon that I just preached was basket case. And we don't understand that if it had not been for God,
My Lord.
some of us would be a basket case.
That's right.
But we must understand that God created the basket, and he put us in the basket to save us from becoming a basket case. And so God set up this situation for you.
That's it.
He orchestrated this situation for you. All you have to do is just like the word of God says, the good steps of a man.
Ordered.
The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. We have a saying at the tabernacle, kind of coined it, that says it's already done. You just got to catch up to it.
That's it.
You just got to catch up to it. Whatever God has already put in front of you, you just got to catch up to it. You got to put your nose to the grind, and you got to keep pushing forward. No matter what anybody else says to you,
That's it.
keep moving.
And I'm sitting here and something just came in my spirit. We use the word tragedy. Tragedy happened. But the Bible tells us, and it lets us know we're going to have to go through some trials and tribulations. We
Yes.
have to go through it.
Got to.
And however the trial or whatever the trial is, we have no say so. But we got to get the mindset. I always say at Faith and Miracles, our mindset is at the end of it all, we have victory.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We have victory.
Yeah.
Yes. Don't question God. Yes, we do, but don't question him. Teach yourself, learn yourself, not the questions to God. It makes no sense for us to keep saying, Lord, not my will, but your will be done. And we
Right.
don't mean it.
Exactly. Exactly.
You when he's trying to tell you this is my will, I had to take overseer. This is
Yep.
my will.
Yep.
I had to take your mother. This is my will. It has to be done.
Yeah.
But now what are you going to do
Mm-hmm.
when you really see my will? Are you
Yep.
going to accept it
Exactly.
or are you going to reject it?
Exactly. Because I'll testify to this. There was one service that we were having, and the Lord came in and he blessed. And co-pastor, and it's crazy for her to say, but she, the Lord was speaking through her. And ended up letting us know this had to be done.
Mm.
And it blew everybody. Yeah,
Why?
that face right there. That face right there. Everybody sitting up there like, hold up. This is his wife saying.
Wife.
So you know that there had to be a certain level of tug because she was an anointed woman of God. She was powerful.
I was scared of your mother. What?
She was powerful. Listen, there was one time where she was praying for somebody and she literally picked them up and was carrying them from the front of the church to the back of the church while praying for them.
Now,
That's
y'all
how-
know his mother, she wasn't tall.
No, she wasn't. Not at all. But, you know, that's what she said. And that's what the Lord said through her. And we had to accept that. And because we accepted that, we've been off to the races. And we have not looked back yet.
Wow.
Yes, we have had our moments as a ministry, you know, where, you know, things did not, you know, I don't want to say things didn't go right, but actually God has blessed where there's been more things going right than is going wrong.
Right.
But as far as having emotional moments, yes, we have had them as a church body because he was so pivotal. The two of them were so pivotal. You know, that's why we have honored them, you know, in the second floor of the church where we have Legacy Hallway. We have their robes hanging on the wall because I don't ever want us to forget about the sacrifice that they made.
Yes.
Because I would tell young pastors, when you become the next pastor, don't sit up there and just throw out, you know, the baby with the bathwater.
That's right.
Because you move too fast, you're going to alienate a whole lot of people. You need to sit up there and take that thing slow walk it. You got to have mixed generations. You can't sit up there and force the old. You can't get with the young. You know, you can't sit up there and alienate the middle class. No, you got to bring them all together. Because if you start throwing out everything, you're going to lose.
Gonna lose. So I want to thank you, my brother, for taking this time to come. You are my second guest.
Thank
And I
you.
was so honored. And my prayer is that I hope that something was said to click in your mind and in your spirit that whatever you're going through, don't give up. See it until the end. Until then, this is Let's Talk with Pastor C. Y'all have a good one. Peace.